Welcome back, fellow cardboarders, and a warm welcome to all my new subscribers. We are way past the 60 subscriber mark and almost at 70 subscribers now. And by the end of the video, if you liked what you saw today, consider joining us. Now, I finally got to make a video on the deck tech of my Yedora the Grave Gardener deck. Let's take a look at her again and see what she does. So for 5 mana, she's a 5/5, legendary Treefall Druid creature, and whenever another non-token creature I control dies, I may return it to the battlefield face down under my control as a forest land. So idea is, I have her on the board, and maybe I block something with my Birds of Paradise, it dies, and it becomes a forest. One of the things that you might notice that is very special about this deck is that the sleeves are the first thing that I chose before building the deck. So I got the sleeves first, I got the forests for the deck, which match the sleeves so that like the creatures blend in with the forests. I actually decided to outer sleeve my sleeves that I can preserve them for longer, so there are actually bigger sleeves that exist with which you can protect your actual sleeves so that the artwork on the sleeve and just the general condition of your sleeve stays the same, while the outer sleeves are what are getting used up by the time. There are actually 2 other sleeves. I will put them up on screen, which you could use if you can't find those. I had to look for a couple of weeks to even find any. I actually do prefer the broccoli sleeves, the Theros Land sleeves, but I just couldn't find any, and in the end I was so lucky as to be able to find someone who had 101 of these locally, and he sent them to me for a fair price. I think I paid around 10 to 12 euros for all of them, including shipping, and I'm very glad I have this deck. And now let's dig into the deck tech. We already started to look at the mana creatures. Now let's really go into it. So I do play about 20 cards, maybe even a little more, that produce mana, and you will see why that is the case while we progress in the video. So we have a couple of mana dorks that you just pay 1 and you have just a dude who gives you a mana. So we have Birds of Paradise, we have Llanowar Elves, we have a Tangled Flora Hedron, which is a very bad mana dork, but I do like to be able to either play him as a land right away or be able to have him as a dork and be able to block or maybe even attack. And when he dies and Yedora is on the board, I'm able to get a forest out of him again. Elvish Mystic, a Boreal Druid, and Fyndhorn Elves. I think that should be it. Yeah, we have this Arbor Druid, which is able to just untap any forest. I do play Yavimaya, so all my lands, even the utility lands, are forests, so I'm able to reuse my utility lands a couple of times with this one. I'm playing Spring Bloom Druid, which just is kind of Harrow on a creature, though not really Harrow since he puts them into play tap, the forest that he fetches. But yeah, I'm able to sacrifice a land and get 2 out of my deck again. Keep in mind, my lands could actually be creatures, so I'm able to sacrifice my creatures that are actually forests, and I'm able to get 2 more forests out of my deck. I do play 2 cards that are able to give more lands onto the battlefield during each of my turn. So this dinosaur here, as well as Azusa, who's able to put in 2 lands per turn, as well as this enchantment that allows me to untap all my lands. Keep in mind, those could be creatures face down. And yeah, at the end of every of my turns. I also play Earthcraft. I do not play the Earthcraft and Squirrel Nest combo, but it would be a possibility, but I just chose not to do that. So if you want to replicate this deck and want to put this combo in, you just could do that and make an infinite amount of squirrels, because that's fun, obviously. But just being able to untap my lands by tapping my creatures is so great. I play a Soul Ring. This could just be replaced with any mana dork, but I just had this around. I just thought, why not? 1 mana for 2 mana. Why not? Splendid Reclamation. I'm able to sacrifice a bunch of my lands, and I am also able to recur them with this card, putting them back onto the battlefield tapped. Now, this deck is advertised as being mono-green Aristocrats. So this guy is able to be sacrificed for a land. So I sacrifice him, and with Yedora out, he turns into a forest, and I get another forest tapped into play with this ability. So he actually counts for 2 lands. So he fetches 1 out of my deck and turns into a forest. And this is what I want to build on with this deck. The second effect is not relevant for this deck. Let's look at the second creature I can sacrifice. Same idea, I have a 1/1 for 1, I can just sacrifice this Dryad for 2 and get a forest as well as a basic forest out of my deck. Secure Tribe Elder, good old Steve, obviously I play him, sacrifice him and get a forest into play. Some Elk, same ability, also able to fetch a land and turn into a forest. Burnished Heart gives me 2 lands into play and also turns into a forest as long as Yedora is on the battlefield. And now we start to get into the more interesting category, or one of the more interesting categories. This gem is not known by many people. It's just a random uncommon from Zendikar, but let's look what it does. When it comes into play, I have to put 2 lands from my battlefield back into my hand, which seems like a downside, and it gives me 2 mana, so I have a mana rock for 4, and it taps for 2 mana, of any color at least. So it's like a Soul Ring kind of, with colors, but it also forces me to put back 2 lands into my hand. But remember, I have creatures that sacrifice themselves, fetch lands, turn into forests, and I'm able to put back 2 lands with this into my hand and be able to recast these creatures and fetch more lands onto the battlefield, and they turn into lands again. So this is not a downside for me, and keep in mind this kind of effect, because we will have and see more of these cards that are able to return creatures, no, I'm sorry, lands that are creatures back into my hand. Now let's look at the next category of just basic removal cards. So we have this little caterpillar, which is able to sacrifice itself, which is very useful since I do want to sacrifice stuff and turn them into forests, and be also able to remove an artifact and enchantment at instant speed is just so great. Reclamation Sage, she does not have a sacrifice ability, but I just have a solid 2/1 blocker and then turn it into a forest, hopefully. Beast Within, just good removal, nothing to say. Acidic Slime, same thing, but it has Death Touch and is able to turn into a forest with Yedora on board. Now another thing that my deck has is Morph and some Manifest, which we'll look at a later point. But if you look at Yedora again, she allows me to put a creature back into play as a forest if it dies while she's on the board, face down as a land. That means this one is a land, but it also is a face down creature at the same time in this case. So I am able to actually turn it face up for its morph costs and destroy an artifact or enchantment again, block with it, turn it to a forest again, and remove something when I want to turn it face up again. So this is a very nice synergy in this deck. Being able to reuse morph cards, such a wonderful thing. So in this case I have recurring enchantment and artifact removal. This guy does the same thing actually, it has Mega Morph and does the same thing. So it removes an artifact or enchantment. And then it turns face down, and I can turn it face up for 2 mana again and destroy something again. So very nice synergy here and gives it another unique edge, which makes this deck so special. Now I have some board wipes, since green struggles to generally produce any board wipes, except for Azuri's Predation, which I might put in, though it costs like 8 mana if I recall it right. So I chose to put these in instead, and maybe I'll put in Azuri's Predation, but I don't think I need to. And I also, while I played this deck, noticed that I actually don't need that many board wipes. So normally I'm the one that is the threat on board, and people want to remove my creatures, but want to remove Yedora first, obviously, before they can remove my other creatures. Because if they wipe the board, they all turn into forests. Yedora gets also wiped, not turned into a forest, but I have so much mana back on board with the creatures that got removed that I can just recast her and start casting my stuff again. So, and these are very great because if I have them on board, have Yedora out and a couple of creatures, I can actually wipe the board and turn them all into forests if I want to ramp ahead. So these two should cost 4 mana. No, this one is 3 mana and this one is 4 mana. So let's look at the disc at first. This one comes into play tapped, and for 1 mana I can just destroy all artifacts, creatures and enchantments. This one also enters the battlefield tapped, prohibits players from paying life to cast spells or activate abilities, which are not mana abilities. And for X and tap, I can exile the Silex and destroy all cards with mana value X or less, which are not lands during my turn. And lastly, all this dust, the secret lair artwork I just really like. Says that everyone sacrifices their colored permanents. So in other words, forests don't have a color, lands don't have a color in general, so all cards just leave the battlefield that are not lands and artifacts. I have about 9 removal cards, but maybe possibly more, since some of the cards would fall into different categories and sometimes also fall into the removal category. Normally for deck building, I have the rule of thumb of 10 ramp, 10 removal, and 10 card draw, but this deck actually really wants to move fast, get Yedora out as fast as possible to secure my board state and be able to start sacrificing stuff and recurring them as forests. This is why I chose to put in even more ramp. Now let's look at the card draw category. This one just gives me a card for each creature that I control. And maybe you already peeked, I will give you a little teaser of what I'm planning to do with all my forests. I do want to turn them into 1/1 creatures at some point, but I will get to it. But the idea is that I actually have even more creatures on board, and I will draw a card for every creature and every forest on the board. So keep that in mind while looking at the card draw cards. So this one just straight up gives me a bunch of cards. This one just gives me 3, which is just a solid card draw. This one most of the time gives me around 5 cards, since I have a 5/5 commander with Yedora, and sometimes I have a bigger creature with Mykolov maybe, which we'll get to in a second. And I'm also able to have a kind of overrun effect. I do not get trample, but I get +3/+3/+3 for all my creatures, which is solid, but most of the time I will choose the first effect. This one does the same as the Collective Unconscious, though it also gives me 4 life for each creature that is bigger than 4, which is not really relevant for this deck, but the card draw is why I'm playing this. Pokédex allows me to scry at the beginning of upkeep, and whenever I cast a creature spell, I can pay 1 green and draw a card. Solid card, staple, nothing more to say. This card is for each player. I'm still trying that out, but the one or two times I had it on board, it was solid. Just being able to draw cards for every creature that dies is unbelievably helpful. And just for 3 mana is just so useful. So maybe play it when you have a sack engine going already and are able to sacrifice a bunch of stuff right away when you play this. Greater Good, similar. I am able to sacrifice a creature and draw a card equal to the power of the creature I just sacrificed, and then I have to discard 3 cards. Skull Mulcher is a card I haven't tried out yet. It's one of my new additions in this deck, but I think it will be a solid inclusion. This one has Devour 1 and means that I sacrifice any number of creatures and put a +1/+1 counter on it for each creature I just sacrificed. And for each sacrificed creature, I draw a card. So this one again is a 5 mana, just sacrifice all your creatures, turn them into forests and draw a bunch of cards and have this big dude out. And lastly, Skull Clamp. Being able to draw 2 cards whenever a creature dies is just incredible, which is why I think it's banned in Modern, if I'm correct. And having this combo out with turning all my lands into 1/1s and being able to recur them with Yedora again is just crazy. Let's put those back and look at the rest of the deck with cards I didn't find a real category for, but I tried to sort them in a certain way. So this one also allows me to sacrifice a bunch of creatures with Devour and gives me a 1/1 Saproling creature token for each +1/+1 counter during my upkeep. So idea is I just eat all my creatures, turn them into forests, and then get a bunch of 1/1 Saprolings at the next turn and a very huge Mukulov. Curse of Crufix does not count as ramp in my eyes, maybe rather for hitting lands more consistently, but being able just to play your lands from the top of your library is just a solid inclusion. That's why I included her. The Excavator is for if too many of my lands die without Yedora on the battlefield, and being able to play my lands again from the graveyard is a good inclusion in my eyes. This Elder is another creature that can sacrifice itself, and when it dies I get 2 basic lands into my hand, and I also draw a card if I sacrificed this guy for his effect. This Spore Frog is able to sacrifice itself and create a fog effect, so I am not dealt damage during combat if someone attacked me and if I sacrifice him, and then obviously with Yedora out he turns into a forest. This scroll gives me some manifest creatures. As I already teased, this deck plays Morph and Manifest, and being able to secretly manifest, for example, a Spore Frog as a manifested creature, I do play those reminder cards, so people are not confused if this is a forest or a manifested creature. In this case, it's a manifested creature. And I am able to surprise people by paying a green, turning it face up. It's a Spore Frog. They attack me with everything or whatever. I sacrifice it, and it actually turns into a forest. So these are some cute and nice shenanigans I can do with this scroll, and I think I haven't explored this scroll enough to know how far I can get this, but I think this can go quite far in this deck. Whisperwood Elemental, some more manifest. This one just manifests from the top of my library. Maybe shouldn't have this out with the Curse of Crufix, because then everyone knows what I have on top, but I mean, it's not the worst, but then everyone knows what's under there. And the second effect I think activated a couple of times already, when people forget that he has the ability to sacrifice himself, and everything that dies this turn that is face up allows me to manifest the top of my library again. So if they even remove Yedora and then wipe the board, I'm able to sacrifice him, and for the rest of the turn, after a board wipe for example, I am able to get a whole bunch of creatures face down manifested from the top of my library into play. Heroic Intervention to just save my board if something unforeseen happens, just solid card. Or maybe if I want to win the game next turn and want to save my Yedora or something, just a solid inclusion in any green deck in my eyes. This card not many people know about from Urza's Saga. It's an enchantment which I most of the time enchant Yedora with, and when this enchantment falls to the graveyard, I get it back to my hand, so that's great. And I'm able to sacrifice a forest to regenerate the enchanted creature, so Yedora in this case. So even if they destroy Yedora, I can just sacrifice a forest and actually save her from dying, which is so great. And when I have this one out, I'm actually able to just also keep the land, since it will just turn back into a face-down land. This guy is in here for its morph ability and giving me a couple of saprolings and also boosting them. So he gives all the saprolings +1/+1. It has morph for 3 and 2 green. And when he's turned face up, I get 4 1/1 saprolings into play. Idea is I play him as a morph, get the reminder for that as well. Turn him face up for 5, get 4 saprolings. At some point he dies, he turns into a forest, and I'm able to actually turn him face up again for 5 mana and get more saprolings. So again, another instance where I can just use morph over and over again while I have Yedora on the board. Same applies to the Den Protector, which is an Eternal Witness technically when I turn her face up. And well, when she dies and Yedora's out, turns into a forest, I can turn her face up again and get another card from my graveyard. Maybe some more important stuff like the Skull Clamp or other stuff that died. Another E-Wit effect, and seldom I play it as a tapped land on its backside. Then E-Wit itself, just returning a card from my graveyard when it enters the battlefield. And then another interesting card for this deck is the Kitty here, which allows me to pay 2 mana, 1 and a green, and return any creature back to my hand. When my face-down forests, these here, are also creatures, I'm able to pay 2, return my creature back to hand and play it again as a creature and let it die at a later point and let it turn back into a forest again. So this card actually gives me recursion to all my creatures that were turned into forests and I don't longer need, and rather want to have them on the front side than on their back side as a forest. And it also gets indestructible, which is normally not that important, but could save the cat by itself. The last 2 allow me to return forests, normally they are creatures, back to my hand, and untap a creature. Both of them can only be activated once each turn, but just generally being able to return a face-down creature that was turned into a forest earlier back to your hand and being able to play them during your turn again is very undervalued in my eyes and should not be overlooked. The untap effect is a nice addition in my eyes, but not the main reason why I play it. I think I play around 40 forests. Let's see, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 2, 4. Yeah, exactly 20 of these wonderful John Avon forests. And I play a bunch of utility lands. This one probably more for fun than as for use. It's a morph land that I can turn face up and actually use as a land. For 2, normally I would just let it die and turn into a forest because it gives me green, then just colorless. Yavimaya, very useful, turning everything into forests. Some land removal if someone plays some really mean lands. If I draw too many cards or have too many lands, I can just cycle this and draw a new card. This one has Hideaway, which I can activate if I have creatures with a total power of 10 on the board and just play the card for free, which I exiled. This one I sacrifice when Yedora gets killed too often and I need to play her for cheaper. Already used that a couple of times. This one allows me to play spells as though they had flash for 1 turn when I sacrifice it. Haven't used it yet, but I think it could come in handy one day. This one is a 1/1 Dryad that is also a forest, and if she dies, guess what? She turns into a forest. High Market is a great sack land where I'm able to sacrifice a creature to, most of the time, turn it into a forest and also gain 1 life. This one I would also put into the removal category, because it exiles all the graveyards, and if there's nothing important in my graveyard, I just don't care and I'm able to deal with some pesky recursion decks. Blast Zone, also kind of a board wipe, which wipes everything that has the exact mana costs as there are counters on this land. It enters with a counter and I'm able to pay double X to add more counters on it, and at a later point I can sacrifice it. Also saved me the game a couple of times, so I think this is kind of a underplayed card. Lotus Field, also a great card to get back some of my turned creatures, which turned into forest, back into my hand. So this is why I play this one, and the Guildless Commons, which also returns a land, and the Jungle Basin, which also returns a land. Now, let's get in the most spicy stuff of the deck, which makes it, in my eyes, very unique. As you might have noticed, I do not play any landfall abilities. This was one of the challenges I set for myself, because I think Yedora can be abused a lot with landfall. So you just block and it turns into a forest, hey, landfall again. And I just didn't want to build that. I wanted to really include these kinds of cards, which turn my lands into 1/1 creatures, and lean very heavy on it and have this aristocracy feel, which you'll see in a second why I call it that. So I play Living Plane, which turns all lands from everyone into 1/1 creatures, not only mine. Very useful if I have a board wipe effect, so this one could win by wiping the board as well. So this one would do that. This one would do the trick. So this one destroys all creatures, it doesn't say non-land or anything, and Yedora on board, and no one has any lands on the playing field except for me, since Yedora will turn all my forests, which are 1/1 creatures, guess what, into forests. So I love that interaction. Haven't pulled it off yet, but I'm trying. Then we have this card here from Mercadian Masks, which allows me to have all lands turn into 2/2 creatures from everyone again. And this is very important to look at the wording here. This one says until end of turn for all lands, and not the lands I control yet. So I ordered a card earlier, a couple of weeks earlier, and this one only said that all my creatures I have on the battlefield, all my lands I have on the battlefield would turn into creatures. That would mean if I sacrifice a forest, it comes back as a forest. This one is no longer a land. But with this card here, it is the case. So even lands that enter the battlefield after this card resolves, this is an instant, they will stay lands until the end of the turn, which is very important. I don't want lands for just until they die, but I want to have them for the whole turn. Living Lands also does a similar effect. It turns all forests into 1/1 creatures. When I have Yavimaya in play, there it is. Again, all lands are 1/1 creatures, all forests. And if I don't have it in play, all my forests are 1/1 creatures, or, well, everyone's forests, but if I'm the only one playing green, it would be me. And I think that should be the last one of the lands turning into creature cards. This one says all forests and saprolings are 1/1 saproling and forest creatures. Forest lands, I'm sorry, in addition to their other types. So all saprolings become 1/1 forests, and the other way around, all forests become 1/1 saprolings. So in other words, my forests are 1/1 saprolings. The second effect I don't really care about. I do play a couple of saproling creators, like this one and the morph card, but it's not why I have this in here. It's for the sake of turning my forests and my turned around creatures that are forests into 1/1s again. So, and let's look why. These 4 enchantments are giving me the opportunity to turn my lands into creatures, And here are a couple of infinite combos which I can pull off then. Always keep in mind I have one of these out, and Yedora, and maybe a creature or whatever, and this card, for example. So I'm able to create an infinite amount of mana by sacrificing a creature. Why? Because I sacrifice this, with Yedora out, it turns into a 1/1 forest, and I'm able to sacrifice it again. I'm even able to tap it if it has haste. I do not play Concordant Crossroads, but I'm playing with the thought of adding that as well. With Earthcraft, I'm able to tap it and untap a normal forest, for example, that I haven't sacrificed or put into play this turn. And with infinite amount of mana, obviously I'm able to play all my cards, or return with the cat all my cards back into hand, or I'm able to have an infinite amount of morph triggers, but I'm also able to probably draw a couple of cards. So remember the Skullclamp combo, which allows me to dig through my whole deck. These two normally win me the game. We have Zuran Orb, which allows me to sacrifice a land or a turned around creature, which is a land as well, and gain 2 life. And with Yedora out, I get them again and again and again, and I have an infinite amount of life. This doesn't win me the game, but if I don't find anything better and don't have the card draw, I might as well just stick to an infinite amount of life and try to win on the next turn. Blasting Station is a card that actually wins me the game. So I'm able to, with Yedora out and one of the enchantments here, I'm able to sacrifice a creature and tap it. It turns into a forest with Yedora out. And this also says when a creature comes into play, it untaps again. So I'm able to sacrifice this 1/1 land again, tap it, and deal 1 damage. It comes into play with Yedora as a 1/1 creature again, and I'm able to untap it again and deal an infinite amount of damage to all creatures and all players. Storm Cauldron is an incredible card in this deck, since I'm able to use turned around creatures to tap them for mana and return them back to my hand and play them again. This one by itself doesn't win me the game, but it stalls the game a little bit, since no one else can really use their lands usefully, and if they do, they return a bunch of lands to their hands. The ability that everyone can play an additional amount of lands normally is not a downside, but an upside. So having an infinite amount of mana with Phyrexian Altar, for example, and Storm Cauldron gives me an infinite amount of creatures I can return and cast again, and probably win the game through one way or the other. I think this card is quite underplayed and should be played more in decks that like to do shenanigans with lands. Ashnod's Altar, very similar to the Phyrexian Altar, not much to explain here. This altar, though, also wins me the game. This one will mill everyone out by sacrificing turned around creatures again and again and again, and milling your opponents by the amount of power the creature has. Most of the time that would be 1. You could also add the Altar of the Brood, which I have actually ordered, but it hasn't arrived yet, and will probably include, which says that whenever a permanent enters the battlefield, I think every player or 1 player mills a card, and that would also win me the game, obviously, if the opponents don't have anything to interact with, or an Eldrazi, or anything that shuffles itself back into their library. Lastly, the Cloudstone Curio allows me to return a turned around creature back to hand whenever a land enters the battlefield. So this one you could argue is kind of Landfall, but it's not really, because it says for any permanent that is not an artifact. So whenever I play a land, or whenever a creature is turned face down and comes into play, I am able to return another permanent of the same time back to my hand. So let's say I have another Frinthorn Elf here, and maybe, I don't know, this one dies and turns into a forest. I'm able to return one of those 2 again and be able to play it again. So this was my Yedora Gravegardener mono-green Aristocrats deck. Let me know what you think of it, if you liked it. I have a full deck list in the description down below if you want to take a look at it. I'm obviously open for any feedback. If you would add or remove any of the cards, let me know your crazy ideas, and maybe I will be inspired to build this deck. This one, by the way, credits go to a certain Twitter user that posted the idea of a friend on Twitter, and I was just blown away by this idea and just had to build it myself, and it's just so much fun to play. I hope to see you in the comments, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye bye!